Luke chapter 24. We're going to start in verse 13. So this is, we've been in John the last couple weeks. If you haven't been here looking at John's account of Easter, we're now jumping back to Luke and his discussion of what happened. And so this passage that we're going to read, this is Easter Sunday. We're back to Easter Sunday. Verse 13, that very day, what day was that? There you go. That very day, two of them were going to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. And they were talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing together, Jesus himself drew near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him, and he said to them, "What is this conversation that you are holding with each other as you walk?" And they stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, named Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" And he said to them, "What things?" And they said to him, "Concerning Jesus of Nazareth, a man who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things happened. Moreover, some women of our company amazed us. They went at the tomb early in the morning. They were at the tomb early in the morning, and when they did not find his body, they came back, saying that they had seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but him they did not see. And he said to them, "O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. So they drew near to the village of which they were going. He acted as if he were going farther, but they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, for it is toward evening, and the day is now far spent." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took the bread and blessed it and broke it and gave it to them. And their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Did not our hearts burn within us while he talked to us on the road, while he opened to us the scriptures?" And they rose that same hour and returned to Jerusalem. And they found the 11 and those who were with them gathered together, saying, "The Lord has risen indeed and has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he was made known to them in the breaking of the bread. And so it's Sunday. The women have gone to the tomb. They've found the tomb empty. They've spoken to the angels. And they've not found Jesus. They've gone back and told the disciples. The disciples run to the tomb. They check. They find that indeed the tomb is empty, but still they don't see Jesus. So later that day, two of the men involved in what was going on in Jerusalem, two of the men, like we talked about last week, were involved in the ministry. They knew Jesus well. They leave to go to Emmaus. Now, Emmaus was about 7 miles from Jerusalem. It was a very close town. And interestingly and conveniently enough for us, it's the exact same distance as from our church here to the Price Chopper Big Lots complex. So have that in your minds, that the distance these men were traveling was like walking from our front door to Morrisville, right? And all the shops right there. So that's the trek that they were making. According to Google Maps, it's about a 2.5-hour walk as an American travels. Maybe they could do it in an hour and a half. I don't know, but that's what Google says. It's about a 2 to 2.5-hour walk. So this was not a full day's journey, but it was certainly not just a small walk around the block either. So these men are traveling along this road, and they're talking about everything that's been happening with Jesus. They're talking about the trial and the betrayal. They're talking about the crucifixion, the day in the grave, and then most importantly, this incredible, crazy story from the women and the other disciples about how the tomb is empty and how nobody knows where Jesus is. Now, in the middle of this conversation about Jesus, he just walks up among them, And for whatever reason, and we don't know how it happened, but for whatever reason, they didn't recognize him. When he walked up, they somehow apparently didn't notice the nail holes in his hands. I think that's a little unobservant, but that's just me. They didn't notice the hole. They didn't recognize his face, and they didn't even, at least cognitively, recognize the words that he was speaking and the way that he was talking to them. And so he comes up and he asks them what they're talking about. And Jesus, it's kind of funny, he comes up, they're looking sad, and he says, well, what are you guys talking about? And they're like, are you the only person that doesn't know what's going on? I mean, everybody is talking about this. How is it that you don't know about Jesus? And Jesus says, I don't know, why don't you tell me about him? And so they do, and they share what they've been talking about. They explain the crucifixion, and then talk about the empty grave and all of this. And Jesus looks at them and he rebukes them. He calls them foolish, and then he preaches for the rest of the journey. Now, a couple things to bear in mind here. First, the text implies that when Jesus came to these men, they were close to Jerusalem, because they clearly see that he came from the city, so the city was probably not far behind, and so they assume that Jesus is walking out of the city with them, right? And so he comes to them fairly early in this 2.5-hour journey, and he walks up and immediately he asks them what it is that they're talking about, from which he starts his sermon and teaching about, starting with Moses and the prophets all the way through the Old Testament to himself, about what was happening. And so Jesus spends the better part of this 2 or 2.5-hour journey explaining and teaching and preaching exactly why and how he came to die on the cross. They get to the town. Jesus, still fooling these guys, acts like he's going further. And they say, no, you've got to come stay with us. They say, look, it's late. It's way too late to keep moving. It's time to get off the road. It's time to go inside. Let's go in. Let's wash our feet. Let's clean up. Let's have a meal together. Let's eat, and then let's go to bed. You can go on your way in the morning. They say, Jesus. Well, they don't say Jesus because they hadn't figured it out yet. They say, Sir, it's too late to be traveling, which is significant later. They say, it's too late to be traveling. Come inside and eat. So they go into the house. And as was the custom, they most likely, if they had a servant, the servant would have washed Jesus' feet. Someone would have washed Jesus' feet. They clean up. There was ceremony. There were things that they did. And so Jesus went in. They did the washing. They reclined. They had dinner, made the food, sat down. And at the meal, as they're eating, Jesus takes the bread and he breaks it, as he did the night of Passover with the first Lord's Supper. Now, what's interesting to me is that these men that he's eating with were not among the 12, now 11. They weren't among the disciples who were there on Passover. And yet, it is in the breaking of bread that they see Jesus for who he was. Which tells us one thing. It tells us that the breaking of the bread, it wasn't like a memory trigger. Okay? This isn't like when you see someone who's suffering from Alzheimer's or dementia, and there's a trigger memory that brings something to mind. This wasn't just forgetfulness or anything like that, because they weren't there when Jesus broke the bread. And I can't say this for sure. This is just opinion, so take it at that. But I'm guessing that after Jesus broke bread with the disciples and went in the garden and was arrested, and then the trial the next day in the crucifixion, I don't know that the disciples necessarily had time afterwards to share with all of the other believers what happened with the breaking of the bread. But either way, these two were not aware. They didn't have it in their brain. They didn't watch Jesus break the bread on that Thursday night. And so this isn't just a memory trigger, which is sometimes how we read it. And they didn't recognize his face because he was resurrected and maybe he looked differently, and they didn't recognize his teachings because they just weren't expecting him to be there. But when he broke the bread, it was just this mental trigger that pulled back all of these memories, and they realized, I don't think it was about that, because there's no reason for it to be. And what that tells us is that if it wasn't about memory, if this wasn't a physical experience, that there was something spiritually significant about Jesus breaking bread with these men. And we know something significant happened because look what happens next. It says in verse 33, "And they rose that same hour and returned to Jerusalem." Now remember that just before this, they're urging Jesus to stay with them because it's too late to travel. So they enter Emmaus. Jesus and the two men, they say, "Look, sir, you cannot go any farther. It is far too late. It is not the time to be on the road. It's dangerous. It's dark. This is not the time to go out." After they said that, they come inside, they wash up, they get ready for dinner, they wait for the meal to be cooked, they eat the meal, he breaks the bread, and he disappears. And that period of time later, they set out for Jerusalem. These men who just hours before were saying it's far too late, it's very specific that that same hour they left. So this encounter with Jesus was significant enough that they did something that was culturally unacceptable, they did something that was irrational, something that was dangerous, something that they urged other people not to do because of this moment and the significance that it had in their lives. So there's something going on in the breaking of bread. We're going to jump back a little bit and look into these guys' story. Now what's interesting about these two men is of all the people that Jesus rebukes in the Bible, these guys really aren't that bad, right? Especially by our standards. I mean, they're walking down the road, essentially having a sort of small group Bible study. They're walking around talking about Jesus. They're spending their time together, they're spending their walk discussing what it is that Jesus' death meant and what it means that his tomb is empty. They're talking about Jesus. They're not talking about anger. They're not filled with wrath. They're not talking about how they're jealous of somebody else. They're not having a conversation they're not bullying other people or making fun. They're not gossiping. They're not slandering people. They're talking about Jesus. So these aren't awful guys. They're not hatching their plot to rob a bank. There's nothing terrible going up. Jesus didn't show up with these guys to stop the two most evil men in the world. He showed up with two people that were talking about him, something that we always assume means a good thing. Now, hey, I was talking about Jesus. I must have been doing okay. That's what these guys are doing. But look what he says in verse 25. Jesus comes up, and when they talk about his death, he calls them foolish, and he calls them slow of heart, which I don't know about you, but if I'm having a Bible study and Jesus shows up and gives me his critique, if he says, you're foolish and slow of heart person, that's not the response that I'm expecting. Like, hey, Jesus, I'm talking about you. We're reading the Bible here. We're supposed to be doing a good thing, but that's what he says. So there's two pieces. There's two things that they're doing wrong. One is that they're being foolish, and two is that they're being slow of heart. So the first thing Jesus does is he corrects the first problem, them being foolish. He says, you guys are not getting it. You're not using your heads. Think about it. And so he starts with Moses and he works through the whole Old Testament and says, look, use your brains a little bit here. This is why this had to happen. If you go back, if you understand the scriptures, the Messiah had to come and he had to suffer. He says, I don't know why you guys got so off track and so convinced that when the Messiah came, everything was going to be perfect. Don't you realize that the system was broken? And that in order to fix the broken system, you needed a broken Messiah. He says, you're foolish. And he teaches them along that road to correct the foolishness that was in their minds. What was interesting about it was they didn't even know that it happened. They didn't even know that it was Jesus that was speaking to them to correct the error in what they were thinking. And as I think about us, church, I wonder how many times is God working in our lives to change something that's wrong with us, and we don't even recognize that he's working. That he's working to change our mindset, he's working to change our hearts, and like these men on the road, we just don't get it. We don't, for whatever reason, we don't even notice that he's there. He continues with them. Interestingly enough, he doesn't force his way in. They invite him into the house. And they say, man, there's something about you. Because they could have urged him not to go on without inviting him over. They could have said, you know what, I think you should find a place to live. There's a motel down the street. Go stay at the inn. But they invite him into their house to stay with them. So they knew something was going on. They knew that there was something about this mysterious man that was walking with them that just drew them to him. There was a reason why, and they wanted him to be a part of them. So they invited him into the house, which is where Jesus corrects the second problem, them being slow of heart. Because Jesus looks at him and says, he's got to be thinking, you're telling me that the Messiah was killed. And you're telling me that the women say he's not in the grave. His body is nowhere to be found. And you pick this time to leave Jerusalem. That your Savior, who you clearly love, who you care about, and you're excited about what he's doing, and you're passionate in your love for him, he was killed, and all of a sudden he's not in the grave, and you don't want to wait and find out what happened? You don't want to wait and see if maybe he's back? Why are you so slow to believe that your Savior has been resurrected from the dead? Why are you so slow to believe that you'll leave the place where he is most likely to be, to the point where the Savior had to chase them to get them back? And that he fixes when he sits with them. Now it's interesting. At the end of verse 27, they didn't go back to Jerusalem. At the end of verse 27, they understood everything. They understood why he had to suffer. Their confusion and their doubt, it was all gone. And if they understood why he had to die, if they understood that it was part of the plan, then there was no longer any reason to be scared or terrified or confused, and yet they still didn't go back to Jerusalem after verse 27. That even with this incredible challenge that Jesus put in front of them to believe in a different way, even after they accepted that, and they believed it, and they understood, they still had not been changed enough to go back to Jerusalem. They still continued to their house in Emmaus. They'd been challenged, but they hadn't been changed. And likewise, we can get all kinds of information, and God can work on the things that we're doing. He can put challenges in our life that encourage us to be more patient or to be more loving, challenges where we need to understand that we need to trust in him. But like these men, that doesn't quite do it. At the end of verse 27, they still have not headed back to Jerusalem. And so he goes in and he sits at the table with them. And he breaks the bread. And in that communion with him, in that closeness, in that intimacy of sharing the meal and being with him, their eyes were opened. They saw him for who he was. And that's when they were changed. And not just changed a little bit. This is what I like to call Jesus-level change. That these are guys that they didn't all of a sudden just get happier. They didn't just say, oh man, now we get it, Jesus is alive. These aren't guys who, they didn't even say, oh man, first thing in the morning, we are headed back to Jerusalem and telling the disciples what happened, or maybe we'll just send them a letter because we're a little bit tired. These are guys that after genuinely encountering Jesus around the table, got up at night when they couldn't see. Remember, they didn't have flashlights. All right? Traveling at night was not easy in these times, and it really wasn't safe. They walked 2.5 hours through the desert at night to find the other disciples and go to them and say, we've seen him, he is alive. Now that's not getting a little better. That's not, well, I'm working on this a little bit. That's not anything small whatsoever that is a Jesus-level change. When Jesus came into their life, when he revealed himself to them, they dramatically changed their attitudes, their actions, what they were doing, what the goal of their life was, and what their purpose was in that moment. Everything about them changed. So they go, the disciples, they walk back the 2.5 hours, they meet with the 11. The disciples say, hey, guess what? He is alive. He appeared to Simon. And then they say, oh, that's incredible. Guess what? We've seen him too. And it says in verse 35, then they told them what had happened on the road and how he was known to them in the breaking of the bread. And so even these men share that it was this breaking of bread that revealed Jesus to them. Even they recognize the significance. So what was it about that action that revealed Jesus to them? Well, the first thing to understand that if you look at verse 35, when they say that Jesus was known to them, it's important to understand the wording here in the Greek. Now, the Greek word for know in this instance is the Greek word gnosko. Some of you might have heard it before. I know that you all do Greek studies on the side when you're bored. Greek word gnosko. Now, there's two words for Greek for know in the Greek language. The other one means basically to understand facts and figures. If you tell me what your birthday is, that's a bad example because I'll forget. I know that the wall is white because I looked at it. I know what year my truck is because I remember when I bought it. I know the price of gas most days. I know facts and figure stuff. You with me? Need more examples? You got it? Okay. Facts and figures. Stuff that you can learn, you file it away, you read it in a book. This word, gnosko, is very different. Gnosko is the kind of knowing that it doesn't happen in a moment. Because you can tell me your age, and I understand it like that. I have full comprehension of how old you are, and I know that fact as completely as I will ever know that fact. In an instant. Gnosko is the kind of knowing that takes place over time and through intimacy and closeness. This kind of know is the knowing that the Old Testament uses when it talks about sexual intercourse. That this deep, personal, developing kind of know. I know the kind of person my wife is because I live with her. And over the years, I've learned what she does in certain situations, how she reacts to certain people. I know what her heart looks like as it relates to other people. That this is a very intimate type of knowing. That I can learn your birthday or your phone number or your address in a moment, but it takes me a lifetime to know you as a person. You understand? And so it's very significant that they're not just saying, I knew it was him, because that's a name. You can walk in and tell me your name, and I can know you in a moment. And we get so focused on the identity stuff here, right? Because they didn't recognize Jesus, and we're so focused on that detail. But this isn't about knowing that it was Jesus. This isn't just, we realized it was him in the breaking of the bread. It wasn't about facts. It's not, we met this guy, and we didn't know who he was or where he came from or what his birthday was, and then he broke the bread, and we were like, it's Jesus, he preached, he's a prophet, he was crucified, and apparently now he's resurrected. Those are facts. It wasn't about that. They didn't say, we realized we recognized his face. We remembered his miracles in the breaking of the bread. They say, we gnoskoed him in the breaking of the bread, which means in that moment when he broke the bread and he gave it to us, we were intimately connected with him. We understood who he was. We understood what his purpose was. And we were drawn into a relationship with our Savior and Messiah when he broke the bread and he gave it to us. That's what they were talking about. And so what is it about the bread that was so incredibly important? There are very few commands that Jesus gave to the church. He didn't command what kind of music we sing. Contrary to some popular belief, Jesus himself did not command that we dress up on Sunday. He didn't command that we sing any type of music. He didn't command what our buildings would look like. He didn't even command that we meet on Sunday morning. There were only a couple things that he commanded about the church. One of them was the breaking of the bread. And when he came with his disciples on that Thursday night, on Passover, and when he said, this Passover meal, it symbolizes me. I am the fulfillment of this. And so when you break this bread, do it in remembrance of me. When you come together as a church, break the bread and drink of the cup to remember my sacrifice. It was a command that he gave. One of the few things that Jesus said we had to do in church. And the reason why is that when we come around a table together, there's intimacy in the body. That we can sit at home and do Bible studies on our own, but that's not what the church is supposed to be. We can even come to church and we sing the songs and we listen to the sermon and we write our notes, and as soon as it's over, we're out in the parking lot and we're gone. You can sit in the pews by yourself. We come to the table together. And so when we remember, when we celebrate, the breaking of the bread is the heart of who we are as a church. And that doesn't mean that we only experience God's grace on the Sundays we do communion, but it is one of the defining characteristics of who we are, that even if we don't have the elements at the front of the church, the community and the communion, the knowing of Christ that they symbolize and enable, should be woven into who we are. Communion is the definition of the church, even when the bread and the cup are not present. And here's the thing, church. You can eat with anyone. You can have a meal with anyone. But when we break bread as a church, when we come together in the power and spirit of Jesus, He's made known to us in the same way He was made known to these two men. And though we eat a lot of meals with a lot of different people, when we fellowship as a church and Jesus is involved, that is what brings Jesus-level change into our lives. That is what radically changes who we are and what we do. And so, we're a week early because it's not the first of the month, but we're going to share communion this week. And this is an invitation to first of all be a part of the body of Christ. That we come together and there's no standards, there's no denominations at the table. If you believe in Jesus Christ, if you want to believe in Jesus Christ, you are welcome to partake with us. It is community and it is communion. And I pray that you open your hearts in the same way that these men invited Jesus into their house. Open yourselves up to allowing Jesus to come in and make Himself known to you. Not knowing about Jesus, I know about Easter, I know what happened, I've read the Bible, I know what Jesus did. That's not what we're looking for. That He wants to just gnosko with you, that He wants to intimately reveal Himself to you, reveal who He is and who He wants you to be in Him.